I want you to picture this. At the exact moment, millions of people in Moscow were counting down to the new year, believing their city was untouchable, believing the system was in control. The lights went out. Not in a suburb, not on the outskirts, but at the symbolic heart of Russian certainty. This wasn't a blackout. It was a revelation. I've spent decades studying global power systems, and I can tell you this with absolute clarity. Empires don't fall when they're attacked. They fall when their illusions fail. What happened that night wasn't about celebration or sabotage. It was about the quiet collapse of a belief that money guarantees security, that scale guarantees dominance, that control can be bought. A $100 million spectacle was erased by something far smaller, far cheaper, and far smarter. If you think this story is about drones, you're already missing the point. Stay with me. Because before we examine how it happened, we have to understand why this illusion existed in the first place. To understand why this mattered, we have to be precise about the problem. This was not an isolated strike. It was not a lucky hit. And it was not about physical damage alone. What collapsed that night was a narrative. For years, Moscow has invested billions into a single message: stability is guaranteed, that the state is strong, that life is protected, that war happens far away, somewhere abstract, somewhere controllable. VDNKH exists for one reason only: to make that message visible. Lights, music, scale, spectacle, a reassurance machine built for domestic consumption. But power systems don't care about narratives. They care about inputs, vulnerabilities, and cost ratios. Ukraine didn't challenge Russia on the battlefield that night. It challenged the underlying assumption that size equals safety. When a system built to project confidence fails publicly, it creates something far more dangerous than panic. It creates doubt. And doubt spreads faster than fear. Before we talk about how the strike unfolded, we need to look backward at how this illusion of untouchability was constructed in the first place. To understand how this illusion was built, we need to step back. Modern Russia did not inherit security. It purchased the appearance of it. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the state learned a hard lesson. Control through fear was expensive, unstable, and slow. So it pivoted to spectacle, to symbolism, to managed normalcy. Instead of telling people they were safe, the system showed them bright cities, endless holidays, infrastructure that looked permanent. VDNKH became part of that architecture. Not a park, not a festival, but a psychological anchor. While resources flowed into visible stability, something else happened quietly. Defense systems became centralized. Power grids became optimized, not diversified. Efficiency replaced redundancy. On paper, this made sense. Centralization lowers cost. Optimization impresses planners. But complex systems have a flaw. They trade resilience for elegance. And when a system is designed to look strong rather than absorb shocks, its failure is not gradual. It is sudden, public, and impossible to explain away. That night in Moscow didn't expose a weakness. It exposed a design philosophy. And design philosophies always fail the same way, all at once. The first crack didn't announce itself with chaos. It arrived quietly. Late December, Moscow at its most self-assured. Lights blazing, music playing, cameras rolling. And just beyond the edge of that spectacle, something else was unfolding unseen. This is the moment many analysts miss. They focus on the impact, not the setup. But power shifts begin long before the lights go out. Ukraine's move wasn't bold because it was loud. It was bold because it was patient. No expensive aircraft, no dramatic escalation. Just a calculated approach aimed at the least glamorous part of the system, the infrastructure no one photographs. This is where modern conflict changes character. Not through brute force, but through cost asymmetry. If you're watching this and thinking, this feels small, that's the point. Small actions inside large systems create outsized consequences. And once that first assumption breaks, that distance equals safety. Everything else becomes negotiable. Stay with me. Because the real crisis wasn't the strike itself. It was what the strike revealed about how the system truly works. Here is the mechanism most people misunderstand. Modern power is no longer about overwhelming force. It's about cost imbalance. Russia's defensive architecture around Moscow is engineered for a specific threat profile: fast jets, large missiles, predictable trajectories. It is designed to fight yesterday's wars efficiently, expensively, and visibly. Ukraine didn't try to overpower that system. It stepped around it. Instead of matching complexity with complexity, it matched simplicity with intelligence. Cheap platforms, distributed risk, algorithms over armor. This is where centralized systems become fragile. Every interceptor fired carries a price tag. Every radar sweep consumes attention. Every response drains capacity. Defensive systems assume the attacker is constrained by cost. When that assumption fails, the math collapses. One side bleeds money to stay safe. The other spends almost nothing to create uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to centralized control. The Kremlin didn't lose power because a transformer failed. It lost power because its system was forced to defend everything all at once. And no system, no matter how well funded, can do that for long. This is where the system began to panic. After the first wave, Moscow's defenses believed they had adapted, targets intercepted, threat neutralized, narrative intact. That confidence lasted minutes, because modern asymmetric warfare doesn't seek confirmation, it seeks exhaustion. The second strike wasn't stronger, it was smarter. While defenses were reloading, recalibrating, overheating, the system was exposed in its most vulnerable state. Transition. Every centralized defense has a dead zone. A moment when attention resets. A moment when assumptions lag behind reality. That moment arrived quietly and then all at once. Suddenly, the defenders weren't choosing targets. They were reacting to uncertainty. Missiles had been spent. Cannons were hot. Electronic countermeasures were screaming into the dark. And still, the threat kept moving. This is the fatal flaw of expensive control systems. They demand certainty to function. When that certainty disappears, the system doesn't degrade gracefully. It spirals. At that point, the outcome was no longer tactical. It was structural. The question was no longer, can this be stopped? It was, how much will break before it ends? Now I want you to shift perspective. Forget strategies. Forget doctrines. Forget drones. Imagine you are there. You're standing in a crowd, music playing, lights everywhere. A moment designed to make you feel safe. And then silence. The screens go black. The music cuts mid-note. The lights don't fade. They die. In that moment, something inside you changes. Because when infrastructure fails publicly, it doesn't just interrupt a celebration. It rewires trust. You start asking questions you've never asked before. If this can go dark, what else can fail? If this was possible, what have we been told that isn't true? This is how modern power breaks, not through fear, but through doubt. And doubt doesn't stay contained. It travels home with people. Into kitchens, into conversations, into silence. If you've ever lived under a system that promises certainty, you understand how dangerous that feeling is when the promise collapses. Pause for a second. Share this not to spread panic, but awareness. Because what happened that night wasn't aimed at soldiers. It was aimed at perception, and perception is where power truly lives. What happened in Moscow did not stay in Moscow. Power systems are global now. So are the lessons drawn from their failures. Across military ministries, energy agencies, and financial institutions, the same question surfaced almost immediately. What does this mean for us? Because if a capital protected by layered defenses can be destabilized at such low cost, then deterrence itself has changed. This isn't just a Russian problem. It's a systemic one. Every modern state has made the same trade-offs. Efficiency over redundancy, visibility over resilience, cost control over adaptability. And markets understand this faster than governments do. Insurance models shift. Risk premiums rise. Infrastructure suddenly looks less permanent. For countries watching from the sidelines, the message was unmistakable. Future conflicts will not be decided by who owns the most hardware, but by who can exploit the weakest links in interconnected systems. Energy grids, communications, public confidence. This is how local actions become global signals. Not through declarations, not through alliances, but through proof. And once proof exists, it can't be unseen. Which brings us to the most important question of all. What happens next now that the illusion is broken? When systems break publicly, the future doesn't collapse into chaos. It branches. From here, there are three plausible paths. The first is adaptation. States acknowledge what happened and quietly redesign. More redundancy, less spectac. Distributed defense instead of centralized pride. This is the least dramatic outcome and the rarest because it requires humility. Systems must admit they were wrong. The second path is denial. Nothing fundamental changes. Budgets increase, hardware multiplies. Narratives grow louder. This path feels safe in the short term, but it accelerates fragility. It treats a structural failure as a public relations problem. And then there is the third path, escalation. When confidence is shaken and legitimacy is questioned, systems often overreact. They substitute restraint with force, control with coercion. This is where miscalculation lives. History tells us something uncomfortable. Complex systems under stress don't fail because they lack strength. They fail because they respond too rigidly to new realities. What Ukraine demonstrated wasn't just a tactic. It exposed a choice. Adapt to a world where intelligence outpaces expenditure, or double down on a model that no longer works. The future will be decided by which lesson is learned. Here is the insight I want to leave you with. What failed in Moscow was not a transformer. It was a way of thinking. For decades, power was measured in scale. Bigger budgets, thicker armor, taller walls. But the world has moved on. Today, power is measured in adaptability, in intelligence, in the ability to learn faster than your opponent can spend. That night revealed something every modern system must now confront. Security built on spectacle is fragile. Control built on cost is temporary. Ukraine didn't win because it had more. It won because it understood the system it was fighting better than the system understood itself. And that lesson doesn't stop at borders. It applies to governments, to corporations, to institutions that believe complexity protects them from disruption. If this analysis helped you see the world a little more clearly, share it, not to glorify conflict, but to understand the forces reshaping power in real time. Subscribe if you want to continue these conversations. Because the most dangerous moments in history aren't loud. They're quiet shifts when old rules stop working and new ones haven't been written yet. And we are living inside one of those moments right now.